extremely fun profession, but there isn't a clear-cut career path to get into it. So today we're answering the question, what are the bare minimum things I need to get into the field? Joining us is CAT Chief Instructor Brian Harris. Brian, how would you characterize the bare minimum in a nutshell?
Right. So, okay, this is a really big topic that a lot of people have asked, and a lot of people want to know, how do I get into this, profession? Because if you look at the blue team side of things, the defense, there's very clear certifications, there's very clear career paths, there's very, all of this. But when it comes to offensive stuff, it's not so clear. And people tend to make the mischaracterization that I got to go straight to lockpicking. Like, it's the first thing that comes up when you think, how do I break into buildings? Lockpicking, right? It's like, but is it? Take a step back. For everybody listening to this, take a step back and think about wherever it is that you work currently, the office that you're in, or if you're, an office that you've been to regularly if you're not currently employed, and think about how would you break into that building. Okay. Everybody who's listening to this probably has some kind of method in their mind of how would I get into the building without authorization to do so. How many of you actually thought lockpicking? Right? So this is the thing. So when you're talking about what are the bare minimum types of things that I need, it's arguably the ability to spot vulnerabilities regardless as to whether or not you can actually exploit them. So you need to actually, let me say it this way. If you are a master lockpicker, right, you can run circles around lockpicking lawyer all day long. He's got nothing on you. But if you fix every single lock-picking-esque vulnerability in a building, that doesn't make it secure. That just means that lock-picking is off the table.
Sure, and there are a million other ways to get in usually.
Exactly, and that's the important part. It's the ability to spot the vulnerabilities and then chain them into realistic exploits, both from an outsider threat vector and from an insider threat vector. So being able to spot these vulnerabilities, figure out which ones are meaningful, figure out how you would chain those realistically into an attack route, that's what you have to actually be able to do. And it's harder than you think, because when you walk through a building, you have to be able to spot realistically, or ideally, every possible vulnerability somebody might take advantage of. And that's really hard. That can be really challenging when you think of all the crazy things out of the box thinking that somebody might do.
Well, and all the different technology, you'd really have to have like an encyclopedic knowledge of all of that.
Right. So you have different pack systems, you have different locks, you have different schedules with meetings, you have different privilege levels of who gets to go into what buildings and on what floors. There's a lot of possible things that can go wrong. There's a lot of possible things that might be able to be taken advantage of. But a lot of people make the two misconceptions when they try to get into an offensive unit like this is, I have to be good at definitely lockpicking, and I have to be really, really good at a lot of things. And it's like, no. You don't have to be really, really good at a lot of things. Of course it helps, right? If you're a cyber pen tester and you can do web apps and APIs and internals and Wi-Fi and all this kind of stuff, that's great, right? That pads your resume. But that doesn't mean you can't, until you can do all of that, you can't be a cyber pen tester. That's not how that works, right? There's a lot of people who got into cyber pen testing only being able to do maybe an internal or only being able to do a web app or something like this. And then once they got into the field, then they slowly padded out their resume, and now they can do a lot of stuff. But in this field, on the offensive side of things, the absolute bare minimum that is non-negotiable is the ability to look at buildings, figure out what's vulnerable about them, both inside and out, from the personal side to the pack system to everything, and then be able to reasonably chain those exploits into an attack route, and then, and this is really important, remediate them.
Sure. When people say they want to get into black teaming, what do they usually think the job is? Because like we said at the beginning, this is a fun job. There's a lot of things that people think it might be. It might look like things on TV, movies, things like that. So what do they think the job is versus what it actually is?
Okay, so it runs the gamut as far as what people think it is. I would say James Bond or something of that akin is what a lot of people think it is. Now, it can be very exciting. I've broken into some of the most secure places on Earth, and I've broken into places where they're spending literally millions of dollars a minute on security for events or locations or whatever, where you're going against military or Secret Service or police or I've gone after places where they've coordinated off parts of cities. So it's, there are a lot of high level kinds of things. But when you talk, let me say it this way, let me back up. When you talk to a cyber pen tester and I ask them, what is your day to day? Most of them are probably going to say web app pen testing. Mm-hmm. Right? That's 9 times out of 10 what we're going to say. I would say 50% of the time we're doing web app pen testing, then 50% of the time we're doing random stuff, IoT or Wi-Fi or whatever. Physical pen testing, black teaming, is very similar to this. Most of the time, it's 50, 60% of the time, you're going to be doing small locations, bank offices, government facilities, these types of things where you may or may not have armed guards. Security is usually going to be anywhere from low to medium, but then every once in a while, maybe 5-10 times a year, you're probably going to do really exciting, really interesting stuff.
And then you will feel like James Bond.
Yeah, where you might go to different countries. You might have to use latex masks. You might have to run some big coordinated thing. But it really kind of varies. But I would say that 50% of the time what you're doing is small locations, government offices, state entity types of things, places where you might expect there to be low to medium security. And then every once in a while you're doing the really high security places, which I'm not going to name by name, but you might do some really fun stuff. Maybe you're doing offshore stuff where you're on boats. Maybe you're doing military. Maybe you're doing whatever. And of course, this really depends on who your employer is. If your employer is on the private side versus the public side. And we talked about this in another podcast, but generally speaking, the private side, you get all the money, but the engagements are kind of like,
more like web app-y, kind of black team version of web apps.
Kind of like that, yeah. If you're on the private side of engagements, I would say that most of your stuff is, I'd say about like 70 to 80% of the time, it's usually kind of the low to medium security stuff, and then 20% of the time, it's like the really exciting, super high-end stuff. If you're on the government side, it's probably closer to 40, 60, 50, 50, somewhere in there. But it depends. It depends on what you want to do, right? I mean, the exciting stuff is exciting, but you're going to be traveling all the time. And you may find yourself scaling up the side of buildings, rappelling down the side of buildings. You might find yourself going up against heavily armed people. I mean, so you do have to, there is pros and cons. There's trade-offs.
In terms of breaking in, it seems like breaking in would actually be very different if you were trying to break in versus via public or private sector. Because like what you just said, if public sector gets a lot of these more like really intense, fun jobs, that to me makes me think, okay, someone would need to have a much sharper skill set for that.
Typically, well, yes and no. So ideally, yes, the public side, because they're doing more high-end buildings and higher security, you should have more skills, and they usually do. But the skill sets from the public side might be, I would say, kind of like cross-training. Like you might have somebody from the public side who was a detective for 20 years, right? And they're like, oh, I just want to really do this. And it's like, okay, well, as a detective, you probably, especially as a patrolman or something, you know how to break into buildings. Maybe not covertly, but you know how to use, like snap a Eurocylinder lock, or you know how to scale the side of a building or whatever. I mean, think of firemen. Like, for anybody listening to this, if you want to learn all the non-covert, hyper-destructive ways of breaking into buildings, go look on YouTube or talk to a local fire team on how do you get into buildings. They will have every last tool and method for getting into a building as fast as possible. Doesn't matter if it's steel doors or reinforced glass, they will get in. But all of that said, so when it comes, the vast majority of you who are listening to this are probably coming from the private side. And for the private side, you're probably going to be doing a lot of low to medium security stuff, especially at the beginning. And it's a really excellent place to kind of get your feet wet and learn what to do, what not to do, what works, what doesn't. But this idea that like, well, I have to be a master at lockpicking. It's like, okay, well, but think about that. Really think that through. Think about any general bank, right? A bank branch office. Well, I've talked about this a lot. When you do a physical engagement, right off the bat, you have to decide, do I want to fight the men or do I want to fight the machines? If you break in during the day, you're fighting the men. Social engineering, bypassing people, blending in, cloning badges, disguises, things like this. If you break in at night, none of those things matter. The sensor or the camera does not care if you're wearing a latex mask. The sensor or camera does not care if you've accurately cloned down to the last pixel what the ID card and lanyard looks like. It doesn't care. What it does care about is, did it see motion? Did the PIR sensor detect heat? Right? These are the kinds of things that it's actually looking for. And a lot of times, lock picking, especially going from the outside to the inside, is kind of irrelevant for a lot of this. Where you see a lot of lock picking is inside the buildings, getting into cabinets, getting into server racks, getting into safes, getting into key boxes and things like this. That's where you're going to see most of your lock picking. It's not so much going to be like on the outside of the door, and it's for really obvious reasons, right? Most people in the world don't know how to actually lock pick, but they know what it is. And so if you see somebody on the side of a building screwing with a lock, and they clearly don't have a key, and they're looking kind of nervous, may not know exactly what they're doing as far as technique goes, but they're not supposed to be there.
Sure. So what's the difference between being good at a technique, for example, lockpicking, and being actually useful as an offensive security professional?
Right. Okay. So as I said at the very beginning of this, it doesn't. I'm not just harping on lockpicking, right? If we took just social engineering, if we took social engineering and I just said, okay, you are a master social engineer, but you have no other skills whatsoever. You can't scale buildings. You don't know alarms. You can't clone badges. You can't pick locks. Social engineering is all you have. And let's suppose for a moment that you can somehow make it so that no one in the building is doing anything stupid as far as social engineering goes. No one's going to fail for a phishing attack. Nobody's going to do a USB drop pickup. Nobody's going to be susceptible to tailgating. None of these things are on the table because you've magically fixed all of it. The building still isn't secure because I might be able to lockpick. I might be able to bypass a door. I might be able to, bypass or clone a card or something else, right? So being really good at a skill is useful. It's very, very useful. If you have somebody on your team who can pick any lock like there's no tomorrow, like they just 5 seconds and they're in a door, that's excellent. That's a really, really useful teammate to have. But if that teammate or nobody on your team understands what a vulnerability is or how to bypass things or how to remediate things or how to chain a series of vulnerabilities into an attack route, you're basically just throwing a Hail Mary pass. Hey, there's a door. I bet I could pick that lock and get inside. Okay, what about the alarm? Well, what about it? We're just going to go inside, right? So having a single skill, super useful. But if you don't understand the vulnerabilities and you don't understand how to spot them and you don't understand how to chain them into an exploit or an attack route, it's kind of useless. Think about it. Say you're looking at the outside of the building and you've got a rear door, right? And let's say that you know for a fact that the lock on that door you can pick open in under 30 seconds. Okay, but what about the alarm? What about what's on the other side of that door? Is it an office? Are there people? Is there a camera? What's on there, right? You have no idea. Do you know how to find out? Do you have tools to find out? Could you, and then even if you get into that door, how do you bypass things? Do you know what the path from where you're going to enter into the door to go to where you want to be is? Do you know if the amount of times that I've seen junior students go into a building that so during the CAT course on the final day, we throw them at a real live building and they're like, okay, here's the series of real flags that you have to use, go exploit it, right? And the number of times you'll see people who've never done this before say, oh, the door's open, I can go in. And then they go inside and they trap themselves because it's a one-way secure door, right? Think about the number of times that you might have seen stairwells or really nice apartment complexes or some buildings and offices where you can go in, anyone can go into the stairwell, but you need an access card to get out of the stairwell. Right? And so you can see people run into places because they get overconfident or they get really eager or they Leroy Jenkins it, go in somewhere and screw themselves.
Sure.
And so you have to, it's far more important to be able to be level-headed and note vulnerabilities, note attack paths and things like this than it is to just say, well, I can pick any lock.
Gotcha. So then if you had to reduce black teaming to one foundational skill, it sounds like it would be identifying vulnerabilities.
Correct. Well, because look, what is the job of offensive security at the end of the day? It's to be the reality check for the blue team. That's it. That's all we do. We think of out-of-the-box stuff to keep the blue team honest. The 3 pillars of security are your compliance, the tools that you need to be secure. The blue team, which is how are those tools actually being utilized, and the red team, or in this case the black team, where we're the reality check for the first 2. We're making sure we're keeping them honest, right? And at the end of the day, your ability to keep them honest, your ability to think outside the box requires you to think outside the box. But the only way you can do that is if you can spot vulnerabilities, you can spot exploits, you can be that, interesting thinker who's come up with something novel. And a lot of times, if the only thing that you can do is rely on the one skill that you're really, really good at, well, one, that's great that you do have a skill. And I encourage everybody listening to this, don't think of this podcast as me saying, like, don't bother with lockpicking. Lockpicking is a useful skill, but so is social engineering. So is building scaling. So is alarm bypassing. So is card cloning.
And you can collect those merit badges as you slowly perfect your skills. However, to get started, since that's what the topic is.
Right. But remember, at the end of the day, whether you're on the blue team or the red team or anything else, the entire point of all of this is to increase the security for your client. That's it.
Absolutely.
But you can't really increase the security for your client if you only know how to do one thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So then why is the ability to identify vulnerabilities more important than the ability to exploit them instead of equally
Right.
important?
So I don't necessarily... let's say for a moment that you have... let's say that you know how to spot a cancerous mole, right? Okay, you don't know how to... Maybe you don't know how to cut it off, but you can spot when someone has a malignant melanoma.
Okay.
Okay. Well, which of these is more important to you? That you can cut it off, surgically remove it, or you can tell somebody that they need to go have it removed.
Basically, one is like foundational. The other skill rests upon the ability to see it.
Correct. And so the whole point is that if you can't spot vulnerabilities, then you can't inform your client that it needs to actually be fixed. But also think of it this way. A lot of times on engagements, things are out of scope. You're not allowed to do X. You're not allowed to do Y, right? When I'm operating in Europe, something like 95% of clients will have snappable or drillable Eurocylinder locks. And I know from experience that I can remove that lock by force and replace it in under a minute with a lock that I control. And I know from doing this for decades that this is a trivial matter and anyone can learn to do this very quickly. But if the client turns around and says, well, that's off the table. Well, you still have to know it's a thing. You still have to be able to tell them in the report, hey, just so you know, even though this was not allowed, this is a vulnerability and here's how you solve it. Mm. Because there's a lot of things in pen testing that are going to be out of scope, but that doesn't mean that the bad guy is going to say, well, we would have taken advantage of this, but hey, it's out of scope, so we're not allowed, right? And so you have to be able to spot as many vulnerabilities as possible. Because again, your job is to increase their security, and you can only do that through robust and as thorough as possible assessments.
Mm. So then, obviously, vulnerabilities come in all shapes and sizes. Some are serious, some aren't. So how should someone think about vulnerability severity in terms of physical security?
See, this is a really difficult question. So let's suppose for a moment that you have a chain of exploits. Let's say that you can hop a fence because there's no fence. Let's say you've identified a dead zone, which means there's no cameras, no sensors, no alarms, no nothing that can see in this area. And there's no, which you can utilize the dead zone to move across a fence, down a path, and get access to a rear door. Okay, so that's a series of vulnerabilities, right? You've got dead zones, no fence alarms, etc. And then there's, whatever. So now let's say that they've got a snappable Eurocylinder lock on the door. So you can break the lock from the outside in a few seconds, and then you can either replace the lock or simply just go into the door. And now let's say that once you're inside that door, there's no internal alarms or cameras, in, a warehouse that you happen to be in. Okay, here you have a series of vulnerabilities. And you can see how these series of vulnerabilities in concert together make an attack route, where I can utilize each one in succession to go from the outside of the building into the warehouse of the building and do whatever I want to do. Break things, steal things, whatever. Now, the question is, which of these vulnerabilities, what is their severity level? And that's a really tough one, because in concert together, it's a high to critical vulnerability. But individually, I wouldn't say that having a snappable Eurocylinder lock is a critical vulnerability. But then the other question is, let's suppose for a moment that I have magically made the door inaccessible. I have replaced the snappable Eurocylinder lock with an anti-bump, anti-snap, anti-drill, perfect, cannot be screwed with lock. Okay. Well, that entire attack route is now done, at least in that method. The person still has a dead zone. They can still hop the fence. They can still approach the door and get to it. But if they can't get through the door, because I've fixed it in a way that they can't get through, then that route is now dead. And so, but if the route is dead, then what happened to the other vulnerabilities? If you're going to make the argument that every vulnerability in this chain is a high vulnerability, but if I fix one of them, now the rest are useless.
Sure.
At least in this particular context. And so it's tough. It's tricky to do that. And this is one of the reasons why I kind of shy away from ranking individual vulnerabilities, and I go more towards ranking routes. So when you're doing an individual vulnerability, it can be really tricky to say, like, okay, well, what is the severity of this? Because if I fix something downstream of this and everything upstream of this becomes irrelevant, then they weren't really high or critical vulnerabilities to start with. But so usually when we're doing assessments, we don't rank the individual vulnerability. We rank the routes themselves, like the route as a total, like the amalgamation of using all of these things in concert together.
When you do have this route-based approach, it does seem like the ability to mentally map a facility is probably also a pretty important skill. So how do experienced black teamers approach that?
Right. So this is, okay, so when you're assessing a building, right, and this is a great question because the entire point of this topic is spotting vulnerabilities and how do you get into the field. So realize that on a black team, you have to be as covert as possible. And you're going to accomplish mapping out the building in stages. So the circle, you can think of reconnaissance as kind of like a concentric circles that go from a big circle to little circles nested inside of them, almost like a Russian nesting doll. The outermost circle is going to be OSINT. OSINT allows you to do reconnaissance on the building from as far away as possible, right? You could be on the other side of Earth, as far away as you possibly could be. There's no real risk to you and your team from getting caught doing OSINT, unless you're really stupid. Then you're going to go on to then you're going to go into long-range reconnaissance. This is where you're going to use telescopes, telephoto lenses, hide in hotel rooms, whatever, and you're going to see the building from as far away as possible. You're going to be mapping things like what time did the employees show up? Can I see the funnel, how people come in and out? Can I get a route? Can I get a mapping of the building itself, right? Can I see like, okay, I'm watching this guy in a red shirt. He walked inside. I can see that he's, using some type of access card reader here. And then he goes to the right and there's a stairwell and there was no delay right there. So that stairwell, you can just open the door. So you're like mapping things out as much as possible. Still little risk to your team. Now with the OSINT and the long range, you've got a pretty good idea of the building, its layout, the breadth of it when people show up, when they leave. Then you're going to do short range. Short range is get as close to the building as possible without actually going inside. Sitting on park benches, walking dogs, walking hand in hand, pretending to be on a date with one of your colleagues if they're okay with that. Whatever is sit at a cafe across the street, and you're as close as you can get without actually going inside. And again, same thing. You're gaining information. Now, by the time you've done the OSINT, long range, short range, you should have a really good mapping of the building, its life and breath, all the kinds of things. But now you still don't have much information from the inside. Maybe during long range and short range reconnaissance, you kind of figure some stuff out of the inside of the building, but you're probably not much. It's like a semi-opaque box. You can kind of see inside, but probably not much. This is where embedded reconnaissance come in. So now you're going to find a real or false pretext to get inside the building and see everything you can. And that could be anything, right? That could just be, I'm showing up to use the bathroom. Or, I got my address wrong. I'm supposed to be next door. Or, is there any public accessible anything? A shared office space, a public cafe, anything that's inside. If it's a bank, for instance, I show up for the bank and, I'm here to open a bank account. And you're getting inside to see everything you can. Alarms, dead zones, placements, cards. Maybe you can clone cards. You can start developing assets while you're doing embedded reconnaissance. Like, can you turn somebody on the inside onto your team without them realizing that you're doing it? Building rapport and things like this. But by doing it in stages like this, you can get a really good mapping of the building. But again, in order to map out the building, it's not just about, there's a door here and there's a window here. It's also, there's vulnerabilities here. There are things we could exploit here. They're using clonable cards. They're using a legacy card reader that allows for both, awesome unclonable stuff, but also crappy clonable stuff. I've noticed that there's a rear door that stays open at lunchtime when the cooks are out there smoking. right? So you start understanding what are possibly vulnerabilities as well as mapping out the building. But by doing your stages of reconnaissance, you kind of get all of this in concert together.
Well, also kind of insulating yourself, hopefully, from getting caught.
Correct, because the closer you get to the building, the more likely you and your team are to get burned. So you need to, as you get closer and closer, your knowledge base on the target should be more and more. You should never, ever just walk into a building and just be like, yeah, I'm just going to walk in and see what happens, right?
Leroy Jenkins.
Yeah, Leroy Jenkins it. I mean, it might work for you. And the sad reality is there's a lot of building businesses out there that might actually work. But you shouldn't do that if you're trying to be thorough and professional because, again, it's kind of a Hail Mary pass. I'm hoping that nobody notices me or I don't do anything stupid. Because remember, a lot of teams, especially on the civilian side, a lot of teams are comprised of one or two people. And if one or two, if your team is 1 to 2 people and 1 to 2 of you get burned, okay, you're done.
Well, and also if one person gets burned, all of a sudden they know something is up. It doesn't take burning the entire team,
Right.
So would you say that like Leroy Jenkins approach is the biggest mistake or the most common mistake that black teams make, or if not, what?
I think that the Leroy Jenkins, which is basically just you see an opening and you just rush in without thinking. I think that that's a common thing that a lot of new black team members do because they get really excited. But as far as black teams go, the biggest mistake that they often make is you find one major vulnerability and you stop. Now, again, think of it in the sense of like either a web app pen test and you find one critical vulnerability at the login portal and you say, okay, done. That's it. Or say you take your car in to get full tune-up and the mechanic finds one problem. And the first problem they find, they're like, okay, done. That's the whole checkup, right? Because we found a problem. And it's like, no. That's not how this is supposed to work, right? You're supposed to do a thorough assessment of my car and tell me everything that needs to be fixed, as thorough as possible. And so I would say that for new black team members, one of the biggest mistakes you're going to learn is you're going to Leroy Jenkins it, or you don't know how to manage stress. So when you break into buildings, it's not like breaking into a web app. Like if you're coming from like the cyber pen test field and you break into a web app, you're probably sitting at your home in a safe location where you can get up and you can walk around and get a drink and take some time. But when you're in a building and you're trying to BS people, there is no like, I'm gonna just go off for 5 minutes and relax. Well, you can and you should. These are safe zones. We refer to these as safe zones. Bathrooms, coffee lounges, places, conference rooms, places you can go and kind of relax and take it easy. But a lot of new people, they don't think about that. They just go inside and they make a beeline for the crown jewels without gaining persistence or without really thinking about things or communicating well with the teammates. These are the kinds of the problems that I see a lot with new beginners.
Yeah, it's kind of the misconception of like the longer I spend in here, the more likely I am to get caught, when in fact it's kind of the opposite. Because the longer you spend inside, the more you're like a lamp. You're like a lamp, Yeah, there's Bob. He's always there.
Yeah, so there's paradoxically something referred to as the friendship formula. And basically all this is it's a summation of what rapport or friendship is. And friendship is basically, according to this formula, basically just a sum of proximity, intensity, frequency, and duration. And as you increase any of these things with other people, they trust you more. But conversely, if you decrease these, you trust them less, right? Or your rapport with them is less. And so if you think about a location that you go to regularly, maybe it's a gym, maybe it's a coffee shop, maybe it's the office, right? If you've got a really big office with hundreds of people in it. But think of it in a location that you go to regularly where you see the same people over and over, but you never really interact with them. You just see them, right? They're just kind of a decoration that exists there. Chances are you trust those people more than somebody you've never met before, somebody you just randomly see for the first time on the street. And the rationale is psychologically, you've seen them over and over again, and they act normal. They're not hurting people. They're not stealing from people. They're not doing anything that you might think of as threatening or criminal. And so you trust them more because you've seen them operating in these environments more and more and more. Well, when you go into buildings, the longer you're in the building, it breaks the mental model of a bad guy. The mental model of a thief that we have is somebody with a balaclava sneaking in at 2 o'clock in the morning or something like this, right? We don't think of the bad guy in corporate spaces as the guy who is in a full suit and he shows up at 9 a.m. and he goes straight to a conference room and he opens up his laptop and he's there until 5. That's not what we think of like a thief. But that's almost exactly what we would often do, because the longer you are there inside of a building, you'll learn this when you do your reconnaissance, but the security of the building is not a constant. It's not like this square wave where, at nighttime it's this level and at daytime it's this level, and it's like just 1 to 1, right? It goes from, one thing to next thing and then back to the first, right? So if like at nighttime the security is 80% and then at daytime it's 60%, it's not just like this constant thing. It ebbs and flows throughout the day. So, for example, at the end of the day is usually one of the lowest security postures because there's always a delay. So in Europe, people tend to start funneling out of their offices around 3 o'clock. In the United States, it's usually about 5 o'clock. Mm-hmm. But there's usually a delay from when people start funneling out of the office until the alarms and cameras are set or like the last person leaves. But that delay, especially if it's long, like let's say that, say in the United States, everybody starts leaving at 5 o'clock, but then you've got those really hard workers that are till like 7:30. Mm-hmm. Right? And not until 7:30 does somebody actually turn on all the alarms and cameras.
Sure.
Well, that means that if you're inside that target building earlier in the day and you just wait there until say 6 o'clock or 6:30, that means from about 5 till 7:30, more and more people are leaving the office, which means fewer and fewer eyes, but the alarms and cameras still aren't on. So the security is continuously decreasing between those windows of 5 o'clock and 7:30. And at 7:30, it's at its absolute minimum, where it's one person in the office and you, right? And so it's one of these things that the security of the building is not a constant thing. But again, in order to recognize that as a potential vulnerability, you have to have that skill set. You have to be able to see the breadth of the building and say, oh, if I try to break in at 9 a.m., it's going to be a very different environment than if I try to break into the building at 6:30 p.m., right? You have to be able to see these types of vulnerabilities and then actually do something about it.
Gotcha. So then going back to the most common mistake of, finding one way in and thinking you're done. Mm-hmm. I want to talk a little bit more about attack route thinking and how many routes you need to find and how that kind of works.
Right. Okay, so now, ideally speaking, you should always be as thorough as possible. So even if you don't exploit something because it's not in scope or regardless as to the motivation, you should always try to find as many as possible. Because your client, again, your job is to increase their security, and you can only do that if you test it or at least note it. So the only real instances where you will only do one attack route is a derivative of someone on the board of directors has said, I recognize that we have a serious physical security problem, but I need to convince the board of directors to increase the budget. In that case, it would be catastrophic if you get caught. Because if you break in 5, 10, 15 different ways, the only thing the board of directors is going to focus on is, but we caught him once.
Yeah.
Right? So our security is fine because we caught him. It doesn't matter if he broke in 14 times. If that 15th time he broke in, we caught him, that's what they'll focus on. So in the event that the motivation of the client is something like, well, we need to scare the crap out of the board of directors to increase the security budget so that we can, fix things, then yes, it makes perfect sense to only do one route. But even though you're only doing one route, you should still note other things as you see them. You should note, well, we did note that there's 4 or 5 possible attack routes, but we only chose this one for these reasons. But had we have been so inclined, we could have tried doing X, Y, and Z.
Sure. Would you say then that chaining small weaknesses is often more realistic and perhaps also more valuable than finding one big failure?
Right. So, okay. In physical security, you very rarely have like a catastrophic or critical vulnerability where anyone can just walk off the street, go straight to the server room and do something terrible. That's usually not the case. It can be, and I've seen it happen, but usually what happens is it's a series of small mistakes or things that you've overlooked that can be chained in concert together. Kind of like my example previously, where you have a dead zone and you have no sensors on a fence and you have a snappable Euro cylinder lock, and the warehouse or the factory that door goes to has no alarms or cameras internally. It's like each of these things is in and of itself a relatively small problem. Because let me say it this way, if you left one of those vulnerabilities but fixed everything else, is it any kind of problem? Right? So say that inside the factory there's no alarms and cameras, but every other vulnerability in that chain is fixed. Or doesn't exist. Okay, well, then that entire attack route is done. It's gone, right? Now, you still have other issues where could you come from a different route, or could you deal with insider threats or anything else, and that may still be a thing. But understanding the severity of vulnerabilities is tricky on them, on like individually in this regard, because again, they usually have to be done in concert, and so most of the time you don't see one big glaring critical vulnerability to go from the outside to the crown jewels. You usually see a series of exploits. So think of it this way. If you have an office building and there is a big open rear door that's just left open, right, that anyone can walk into off the street any time of the day, okay, that in and of itself is a big problem. But then the employee would have to go, or that person would have to go from wherever they are, wherever that door leads, to where is most people going to say, the crown jewels? Server room. Mm-hmm. Cybersecurity. We're concerned with the cybersecurity. Okay, well then what happens? They have to come in through that door. There has to be no access checking. There has to be no employee awareness of, hey, this guy is new. I've never seen him here before. There has to be no, they have to have a flat physical network where everybody can go anywhere at any time. And then the crown jewels, whatever that is, the server room, archive room, R&D facility, whatever, has to have no locks, access controls, or anything else. And so but every one of these things is itself a vulnerability. So there really isn't like a thing that just makes a critical vulnerability like that. It's usually like a series of small, stupid things that are used in concert.
So I have a two-part question then about okay, so say you see a vulnerability, but you can't actually take advantage of it because you don't have the skill. Mm-hmm. How do you approach that? And so what is required when you see a vulnerability but you can't exploit it to see how it continues down the chain?
Okay. So
sorry, that's like a really weird way to ask that question, but I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah, no, I understand exactly what you're saying. Okay. For everybody listening to this, pull up an image, Google European tilt window. Mm-hmm. And what you will find, especially like office or high rise or apartments or other things, and what you will find is that Europeans, by and large, have not figured quite out yet that ladders exist. Huh. So a lot of places, whether they're banks, government offices, apartment complexes, or whatever, after the ground floor, people will often leave European tilt windows open 24 hours a day. Well, the problem with that is that European tilt window bypassing is a very, very simple thing, whether you're rappelling, climbing, ladders, whatever. So in this context, if you see a European tilt window, there's a very, very good chance that you can use that window as a door without damaging the window. Google European tilt window bypass. That's a mouthful. And you'll see Blitz. There's a German company called Blitz for firefighters and EMS that makes a really good tool for this. But you can use something as simple as a suction cup, a toilet paper roll with duct tape around it, and a string. Like it's not high-end, James Bond level gadgetry. It's literally like climb up the side of a building or get a ladder or rappel down the side, whichever works for you in the context, bypass the window and go inside. Now, either because it's not in scope or because your employer says you're not climbing up that side of the building
or you can't climb.
You can't climb. All of those things are potential stops for you saying, oh, I could have done X, Y, or Z. I could have bypassed all of your security by taking advantage of this, that, or the other thing. But for one of these reasons, I couldn't do it. Maybe it's you don't have the skills. Maybe it's not in scope. Maybe your employer says, nope, you're not doing that because it's too risky. But you should always report it in the actual report. And if you've done your job, then you would have gotten in anyway. And then you could say, okay, if I had done this, then it would have dumped me on this floor. And then since I've already on this floor, I could say, and then I could have done attack route 1 where I came some other way.
Which is why it's so important to be comprehensive.
Correct. So if you find, let's say for a moment that, you're dealing in Europe because the European tilt window thing, and there's a series of windows on the 4th floor that are all opened, at midnight or wherever, and you could have bypassed it. And then you find a totally different route where you clone someone's badge because they're wearing it outside, and then you copy it, you get a photo of it, you make a digital copy, you copy that to the actual card, you get the lanyard, you impersonate the employee, you go inside, it's a flat physical network, so one card gets you access to everybody, and then using that route, you get to floor 4. Okay, then you could say, had I have been able to do the window thing, I would have been here on this floor. Then what could I have done?
Sure.
Right, and then you could just pick it up from there. But even things that you can't do or are not in scope, if you see them as vulnerabilities, you have to note them. You have to note them. Let me give you an example of the window thing. So there's been, I talked earlier about do you want to fight the men or do you want to fight the machines? Well, one of the best times to fight the machines is when you have buildings where they have their security posture set up really stupidly. Mm-hmm. So there was I won't name names, but there was a fairly well-known company who had a shared office space, and they had an entire floor in a building. And the alarms and cameras were pointed directly at the front and rear doors. And then there was nothing else in the interior of the building. And their argument was, and I know this because I talked to their defense guys, was, well, you have to come in through one of these doors. And so we didn't wire the entire, office space with alarms and cameras because the only thing we were concerned about was people coming in from the doors, either from the rear entrance or from the front. Well, in that particular instance, or similar instances, if you found a European tilt window or any kind of bypass where you're not using one of the doors as an entrance, there is no security. There's no security at night. None whatsoever.
Sure.
Right? So this would be a perfect example of when fighting the machines would be advantageous to you. But here's the question. How do you know that that's their security posture?
Recon and elicitation.
Exactly. And yes, exactly. So you'll do a lot of reconnaissance, probably embedded. You'll look for security providers and others, and you will do a lot of elicitation, right? You'll find people, you'll develop them as assets, you'll get information from them, you'll learn these types of things. And so, but if you don't know how to do these things, if you can't spot vulnerabilities, you'll never know that that's a thing.
So identifying vulnerabilities is the, bare minimum of black teaming. Mm-hmm. But you also need to know how to teach your clients how to remediate.
Correct.
So what does good remediation thinking look like at a beginner level?
Okay. Well, let's first start by saying what is remediation and why is it so damn difficult.
Sure.
We did an entire podcast on why remediation is the hardest part of this entire job. Think of for anybody listening to this, think of any topic, whether it's crime, whether it's, just think of crime. Just pick any criminal element, whether it's phone theft, drug smuggling, gun smuggling, anything. Think of any type of crime and think of where is the hotbed of that particular crime in whatever you want to think of, your city, your state, your country, whatever. Mm-hmm. You know where the problem is. You know what the problem is. Fix it. Mm-hmm. Right? It's the fix it part, the remediation part that's challenging. That's the hard part. So I very regularly go to ports and harbors and places like this to work with security providers. And a lot of security container ships and shipyards and stuff, about 1% to 2% of containers are actually inspected. Mm-hmm. Okay, well that means that if I stick anything, to be a little PC, if I put a football into a container ship that's not supposed to be there, there's a 98 to 99% chance that football is going to get through customs because that container ship is never going to be searched.
Sure.
Right? So that's a huge problem, and everybody is aware of that problem. But fixing the problem is hard. Because most of the time...
Just check every single one.
Exactly. The most of the time, the answer is going to be more money. Most of the time, the answer is going to be spend a ton more money. But you're often going to have other problems. So, for example, anybody who's listening to this who've ever seen an underdoor tool, it's basically a big coat hanger with a wire. And you go under a door, and you grab a door handle from the other side, and you can open it. This is... useful on one-way secure doors like access control card reader doors, where like hotels, for instance, where you need a card to go in one way but nothing to come out the other way. Mm-hmm. Now, what would be a fantastically easy way to solve that problem? Use door knobs. Okay, if you have a door knob and not a door handle, it's very, very difficult for me to grab onto the door knob from the outside. Not impossible, but really hard, right? And for anybody who hasn't ever seen an underdoor tool, just YouTube underdoor tool, and you'll see a million examples of this. However, because of fire code, you can't do that. Because people who have disabilities and they either don't have hands or don't have use of their hands, in the event of a fire, they have to be able to get out of a door. And if the only thing they have is a door knob and they can't get out because they can't twist the door knob, that's a problem.
Sure. So
a lot of times you're not just going to be met with, you need more money to solve this. there's a lot of times that you have to be very, very careful about your recommendations, because if you recommend something like, oh, just switch everything to doorknobs, well, you may be in violation of various laws. So you have to be very careful about how you remediate things. But to go back, so now that everybody's aware of what a remediation is and why there can be problems with this, here's what I recommend everybody listening to this, especially if you're trying to get into this. Think about, do a little walkthrough of your office or even your apartment and look for all the stupid vulnerabilities that you see. Snappable locks, locks that are vulnerable to bumping, lack of alarms, clonable badges, whatever it is, right? Whatever I see everybody tailgating at noon, whatever the vulnerabilities are, do your office, your apartment, wherever, and make a map of all the things. And then go through them and say, how would I fix this?
Sure.
Now, here's the trick. Go through and say, how would I fix each one of these? And then try to do it for bottom dollar. Try to make remediation strategies that will fix the problem that don't cost an arm and a leg.
Sure.
Right? Because see, that at the end of the day is what you're really going to have. And if you want to really, really challenge yourself, after you've done this, assume the client has said no to every one of your recommendations. Because it happens. It really does. Where you give a recommendation and it's cheap and it's effective, but for one reason or another, the client's like, well, we can't do that. What else do you have? What other recommendation could you offer us? Doing that little thought experiment over and over and be like, well, crap, I really wanted to do this, but they said they can't do it, so what else would I do? It will challenge you to think outside the box and think of, how else could I fix this? Because remember, remediation is part of the job. It's at least 50% of offensive security work is fix the thing, right?
Sure.
It's not enough to just say, I found a thing or I exploited a thing.
Well, yeah, because if you can't fix it, then what's the point?
Exactly, right? Like, that's exactly right. If it's an unfixable problem, why do they hire you?
Sure. So then the best way you would recommend for juniors to improve their remediation skills is to walk through places with which they are familiar and identify vulnerabilities and then identify remediation strategies.
Correct.
So then would you also say that the best way to practice vulnerability detection is
similar?
The beginning of that?
Yeah, similar. Like, just walk through your building and try to start mapping out vulnerabilities, right? Now, somebody on Discord asked me this a while back, and it's an excellent question. They asked, how do you get better at vulnerability mapping when there's things out there that you don't know? It's like, yes, there's unknowns, things that we are aware we don't know of. Like if I asked, how do you do partial differential equations, right? Well, most people understand that complex math exists, and most people realize they are illiterate at complex math.
Sure.
That's an unknown. But there are unknown unknowns, which are things you don't know that you don't know about.
Sure.
Right? And a lot of this falls into that category. So one of the I would say fun, but one of the ways that you can figure out what you don't know is walk through a building. Your office is a great one. It's a perfect example because you have access to be there. You're going to be there every day anyway. You can walk through it, whatever. Walk through your office, spot every vulnerability you can think of. Try to take those vulnerabilities and chain them into a route. Okay, I see that our employees are wearing their badges outside of the office when they go to lunch. That's a vulnerability. I see that the lanyards that we're using, the things that hold the badges, are bought on Amazon, so anyone could buy them. That's a vulnerability. I understand that our cards are clonable. That's a vulnerability. And I understand that once you're inside the building, nobody checks anything. So you have basically once you're inside, front heavy security, right? Okay, now, take those things and remediate them, both individually but also as a route. If you could only solve one thing, which would it be, why, and how? Okay, so solve all your problems. Now here's what I would like you to do. Once you've done that and you've mapped out your routes, not the vulnerabilities, but the routes, now say, for whatever reason, those routes are off the table. What else you got? Find another way into the building. So if you are a master lock picker, for instance, you know everything there is to know about lock picking, and you do this little thought experiment. You say, okay, well, I would come in through the rear door, and I know that lock is bumpable, so I'd come in and I'd bump that lock, and I'd be in 5 seconds, and I know that nobody's behind that door, so there's nobody going to hear me banging on the door for 5 seconds, and so I'm inside. Great, okay. Now say lock picking is off the table. Find another way into the building. It will kind of force you
to learn those unknowns.
To be like, okay, crap, like how else would I do this, right? And so you'd have to start thinking about things. You'd listen to conferences, you'd listen to talks, you'd listen to other people. Look for firefighters for destructive entry. Look for podcasts or YouTube or anything for other ideas. Think about every possible thing. Who has access to the building, right? Well, the employees do, contractors do, the janitors do, the delivery guy might. What about somebody who delivers flowers, donuts, or food, right? So you start thinking about all these possible ways into the building. And then you start thinking, okay, how could each one of these people exploit something?
Sure.
And so you just go through this and do these types of thought experiments and always really challenge yourself. Don't just say, well, I would get in by picking a lock or I'd get in by social engineering. It's like, okay, do that. Go through that thought experiment and then remediate them. But then figure out, okay, if that was off the table for whatever reason, how would I get into the building? And then once I figured another way out, say, okay, if that was also off the table, how would I get into the building?
Sure.
And suddenly, once you've done that a few times, especially if you've done it on real engagements, you're going to get so adept at mapping out a building and being like, okay, I'm seeing the building, we've been studying it for a few days, and I've got 20 different ways I could get into this building. And here's a list of all the ways that I could probably get in, all the ways that I'm probably going to get caught, but it might work. And this is how you get better at it,
Sure.
Especially when you're starting out.
So this episode comes with homework.
Yeah.
So we will leave you with that. Breaking into black teaming is not about mastering every tool or technique. Brian has shown us that today. It's about learning how to see systems clearly, where they fail, how those failures connect, and what risk they actually create. That's the real bare minimum of black teaming.